Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. Now that we're a week into June, I thought I'd do my Marginalia video for this past month of May. This brings me full circle because I believe last year May was the first month I did a Marginalia video for as I was starting the channel, figuring things out. And so these will just be stories, poems, essays, whatever I read in the last month that I didn't do any videos about. And then a couple of quick musical selections that I'll link in the description box. One from my maybe Midrash reading, one from some fun geography lessons with my daughter, and then a couple from the film Sylvie's Love, which my wife and I watched last month and really enjoyed watching together. But let's jump into the stories, and it was a great month for stories. Kicking off with The Shadow Kingdom, the first published story by Robert E. Howard's with his character Kull, the Exile of Atlantis. And this is inspired by Michael K. Vaughan's great video on this volume and character. And it's not the first sword and sorcery tale that's actually in this month's Marginalia, but it's the first really excellent one. And Kull is a very different character from Conan the Barbarian, and it's probably my favorite of the Kull stories. Kings of the Night is another very strong one. It's more of a Bran McMorn mashup as well, but I really enjoyed getting back into this volume. I might be reading one of these a month kind of for the rest of the year, but highly recommend Kull. Then I reacquired my copy of Rashomon and 17 Other Stories by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, and inspired in part from the Codex Cantinus great videos, which we'll get to in a moment. But I reread both Rashomon and In a Bamboo Grove, which the title and the setting of the frame narrative of Kurosawa's film Rashomon uses the former. But the actual plot and non-linear narrative, such that it is within the film Rashomon, comes from In a Bamboo Grove. And I had forgotten both the almost nihilistic horror of the story Rashomon by Akutagawa, and how ambiguous. We think of the film Rashomon as being ambiguous, but the actual In a Bamboo Grove story feels even more open-ended and ambiguous. Just a fantastic story, and quite short. Definitely one that, if you can get access to it, one I recommend reading. I also read the short story, and this one was directly inspired by the Codex Cantina, Bee Honey by Banana Yoshimoto, and that was a very dark story as well. Definitely one that explores. It sort of aligned well with that pain over joy tag, with the individual horrors and communal horrors, and whether it's the depredations of violence or more personal feelings from divorce and the loss that is associated with that. So just a very emotionally intense story that does not seem to be what it is on the first page, and then gradually builds and unfolds. So I did read a number of fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm, translated by Philip Pullman, who then always provides some fun little scholarship at the end. But I read Faithful Johannes, which I kind of hated. I read Hansel and Gretel, which was very interesting, very strong. I read Godfather Death, which is now one of my favorite Grimm's fairy tales, and Briar Rose, which was very strong as well. So I really enjoyed all of those. Yeah, Godfather Death, what a story, what a tale. I read The Sandman from the Tales of Hoffmann, ETA Hoffmann. That, again, is a really horrifying tale. These tales, these are quite scary, the tales from ETA Hoffmann. But I encourage you, if you're interested in those types of stories, definitely give them a shot, because they're quite scary. Now, in terms of the actual first sword and sorcery tale, and one that I did not enjoy as much as The Shadow King by Robert E. Howard, comes from Lord Dunsany. It has this long, convoluted title, The Fortress, Unvanquishable, Save for Sacnoth. And the best part of it is this almost Siegfried and the Dragon type thing, where they have to get the metal for the sword from the spine of this dragon-like monster. And to do that, they have to starve the monster to death for 3 days. They can't actually kill it. They have to just keep it from eating anything for 3 days. That was interesting. The actual massacre within the castle didn't feel quite as strong. But Dunsany, I always prefer Dunsany's weird fairy tales, strange, otherworldly ones, rather than his more aggressive sword and sorcery tales. It just doesn't quite ring true. I finished reading Malgudi Days by R.K. Narayan, and these are all set in India, and very, very enjoyable collection of stories. I don't know that there was one where, and I read this over several months, and I didn't know if there was one where I could pinpoint and be like, that's the single best one, but they're all very strong, very enjoyable. They sort of have this O. Henry vibe, but they also have a vibe closer to Anton Chekhov, and I think that's the strength of a strong storyteller. And then, speaking of Chekhov, there was apparently George Saunders published some book where he has different short stories by 4 Russian writers, and then goes into exploring like what the strengths of the stories are, or how they're written. I'm not entirely sure because I haven't read the book, but everybody was posting about it on Instagram, and so I started trying to tease out what were different favorite stories from there, and then went and read or reread some of those, among which was In the Cart by Chekhov, and it's good. I don't know that it's one of Chekhov's best tales in my reading, but other people really enjoyed it, and you might as well. You really can't go wrong with Chekhov and his stories. Another one, I should say, was Singers from Ivan Turgenev's Hunter's Notebook, or Sketches from Hunter's Album. And I liked Singers. There's this incredible singing competition, and the way that there's one that they just are convinced is one, and then this other song occurs that doesn't even seem to be a song at first, and as it shifts, it was just fantastic and amazing. But I also, because I enjoyed the stories in this book, Biege and Prairie is astonishing, but I also read Kasyan from the Distant Lands. I believe that's what it's called, Kasyan from the Distant Lands? Kasyan from the Beautiful Lands. That's a really cool story as well. There's a character there who seems very otherworldly, almost like a dwarf or a gnome, like from mythology. And he's traveling with, the Turgenev stand-in, Hunter. And his daughter is there, and she seems to, sort of be magical or prophetess as well. And it's really a fascinating tale. I enjoyed both of those quite a bit. And that whole volume is quite strong. I found this volume, and then I read a story, and I wondered if it had a connection to Lal Dead from reading Lalla, and it didn't. But it was a fantastic story, and it is, what is it called? Here we go. Lalla's Interests by Vera Mikailovna Inber. And Lalla is this little girl who the little boy whose job it is in and this is in Soviet Russia, the little boy whose job it is to like run the elevator in their apartment building, he has a crush on Lalla, and so one day these little flyers appear, and the children have decided they're going to form a children's Soviet, like a little union they need to have for their rights, and so they get down there and they're going to have this talk, and the little boy knows that Lalla, the girl he has a crush on, she wants to be able to speak, and she has something she wants to bring before this new committee they're forming. So he intentionally is delaying the elevator while her mom and some man from the building are trying to get down there and he's like fiddling with the elevator because he wants Lalla to be able to have her say. And so it's a very sweet tale. It was somewhat satirical of the way bureaucracies can be, but it was a really wonderful tale, and I really enjoyed that. So if you have this volume, check out that story. And then one last story by a Russian, one that I thought was probably the weakest of the different Russian stories I read. And that was from Vladimir Nabokov. And it was A Night in the Museum, Visit to the Museum. It was Visit to the Museum by Vladimir Nabokov. And it was okay. It was kind of supernatural and ghost-like, and I think sometimes Nabokov aims for that and doesn't quite get there. But plenty of great reading there. Now, in terms of poetry, lots of fun. I'm continuing with my Penguin book of modern African poetry and just discovering many wonderful poets in here, up through Madagascar. So, probably about halfway through this volume at this point. It's arranged alphabetically by country. In part with my reading of Conference of the Birds by Attar and then Lalla, I also read some selections from the Masnavi by Rumi, and Rumi's a fantastic poet. This translation by Alan Williams is very readable, very enjoyable, and it's not the only translation I've read of Rumi's poetry from the Masnavi, but it is probably my favorite one. And then more obscure, maybe Midrash reading, the Proslogion by Anselm of Canterbury, famous for his God is an idea, the greater than which nothing can be conceived, and some people go at it. But Anselm, he had been mentioned in something I was reading from Jonathan Edwards, a pair of sermons, God Amongst His People and City on a Hill. And these are from the 18th century, the First Great Awakening here in the United States. And this is sort of inspired by reading Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. And one of the anecdotal pieces of these is that Edwards would he would use shorthand within his sermons. So God might be just G with a D. Christ would just be a big X, like a cross essentially. He would sometimes not even reference the chapter and verse. He would just have the first couple words of a passage, and then just, an ellipsis, ... and it was clear he knew what he was picking up. Or he would have that, and then he'd have another passage he wanted to compare it to, and so he would have 5 words from that to start it. And it was very clear he had memorized the entire Bible. In terms of the content, I thought City on a Hill was interesting in terms of sort of trying to build that ethos of responsibility, the U.S. version of noblesse oblige, such that it is. I also read, again, inspired. This one truly was inspired by reading Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. I read from the Journals of George Fox, and I have it in this modern library, Great Voices of the Reformation. They did a series of sort of philosophical, spiritual anthologies. Starts with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and there's one from India and China. There's one from Judaism, and then there's this one as well. Oh, there's one, the Catholic doctors. But I read the Journals of George Fox, and this is a very good anthology for understanding sort of the many of the prime thinkers in Protestant Christianity. And then to close out my Midrash reading, I read a number of the poems in the American Religious Poems Library of America anthology, particularly those by Emily Dickinson, which are wonderful, as is everything Dickinson wrote. And now, in terms of some more bizarre reading, I've been reading the USA Trilogy in a weekly check-in with Brian at Bookish, and we finished the 42nd Parallel. Neither of us have done a video on it yet, and I'm not just saying that in terms of growth mindset. I'm saying it because we've both talked about trying to think around how we would do one. I think we have different things we would each like to highlight within the 42nd Parallel, and it is a book that I would encourage anyone to read. It's a strong start to the USA Trilogy. 1919 has a bit weaker start in my opinion. But as we're reading it, one of the things Dos Passos does is he takes us to, not just within the U.S., and he takes us all over the U.S., East Coast, West Coast, in the middle of the U.S., up in North Dakota, but he also takes us down to Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And he has some nonfiction written about 5 to 10 years before the USA Trilogy, where he actually writes about being in Mexico. It's called In All Countries is the full book. And he has a section on the Soviet Union, he has a section on the U.S., he has a section on Mexico, and one article, I believe, on Honduras. And then he has a section from the rest of the world. And so I read the Land of Great Volcanoes portion of In All Countries, and I'll probably read one of the other sections as I'm reading 1919, and another section while I'm reading The Big Money, and sort of finish that book this summer. But the essays on the Mexican Revolution and Mexico, on Emiliano Zapata, on Pancho Villa, really interesting, really fascinating, getting into the countryside, even outside of Mexico City, and sort of exploring those more rural provinces, what those were like both during the revolution and then sort of 10 years on. And it definitely provided more context for the 42nd Parallel, but also just interesting writing. So In All Countries. And then to close out, I read a couple of the stories from the Cape Cod Noir. I know a lot of people rip on these anthologies because they're not necessarily closed room door mysteries. And many of them aren't even like private detective or police procedural mysteries. And I think that's what people want in these noir volumes. But they often are, they're noir in the sense of trying to show life in the shadows or life in that liminal space, you know, quite a bit in the darkness, but in the shadows. And I always find that, you know, I just learn a lot about the locale. So this Cape Cod Noir, and I just have read the first 3 stories. So 10-Year Plan by William Hastings, Second Chance by Elyssa East, and Ardent by Dana Cameron. Of those, I really enjoyed Second Chance by Elyssa East. It was set on a little reform school out on an island in Cape Cod, and the boys who live there, and sort of their efforts to try and like build a sense of community, but also realizing that sometimes you know, there can be destructive elements within the community, and that can be scary. So that was my Marginalia reading. Now, in terms of some music, for so maybe Midrash, I'm gonna go with Old to Begin by Pavement from Brighten the Corners. And the reason for that is because the special edition of that album is called the Nicene Creed edition. And so there are some different lyrics on songs in the album that reference like religious thought. And so it's also, this is like a very, very tiny minority opinion. It's Pavement's best album. So they're a weird lo-fi group from the early 90s led by Stephen Malkmus. But it's their best album. It's better than Crooked Rain, and it's certainly better than Wowie Zowie. Second one, got sort of an artifact to show here. This is a cool 3-dimensional map of the world. And by 3-dimensional, what I mean is it's a topographical map where there are mountain ranges, the map is raised and lifted to reflect that. So over here we have like the Himalayas, okay, the Andes along here, over here, and my portion of the country is very rough and bumpy there. And so it's this amazing topographical map that is lifted to show the like actual altitude changes on the physical geography of the world. And as I've been working with our older daughter on some of her geography, and she knows her continents really well, and we're working on her oceans. So we're working on the Atlantic Ocean, and so I'm going to put in Atlantis by Donovan, way down below the ocean. And then from Sylvie's Love, which my wife and I really enjoyed, there were a lot of references to the Immaculate Brilliant Corners album by Thelonious Monk. So I'll just put in the title track Brilliant Corners there. But the whole album's strong, and easily his best of his Riverside albums. And then See You Later Alligator by Bill Haley in the comments. So that was my main Marginalia. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you heard a writer mention that you think I should read something else from. But again, I hope that you're having a great start to June, and I'll see you later. Alligator.